Welcome, folks. Thank you for joining us for today's event. As you can see from our slides, today's event is going to be all about C4's Changing the Conversation podcast. And for this event today, we have the two most frequent hosts of the podcast, Ronnie Hodges and Dr. Ashley Stewart. And we're just going to do our introductory pieces that we typically do before all presentations, and then we will get into the content, the good stuff of today's presentation. Microphones are going to be muted during today's presentation. However, we do encourage folks to join and come on camera and on audio when they have the ability to. Closed captioning is available. You can click on the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen to select the option that works best for you. This webinar is being recorded. The slides and a video archive of the presentation will be emailed to all participants and also featured on the MHTTC website. If you have questions during the webinar, please submit your question via the chat box. The host will share your question with the speakers for a live response during the Q&A portion of the event. If you have any questions after this session, please email newengland@mhttcnetwork.org, and we would love to hear from you. As well, our funding for today's event comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA. The views and opinions expressed in today's sessions are those of the presenters and moderators, not SAMHSA, just so you know. We also use language as part of the MHTTC network that is person-centered, affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented in all activities. During this session, please ensure that whenever you're contributing to our discussion, that you also use language that is affirming, respectful, and strengths-based. And as a committed ally, the New England MHTTC network recognizes that the New England area is home to the ancestral land of many Native tribes. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we acknowledge that all the places our distributed staff live and work, as well as where we provide services and hold events, are Indigenous lands. Myself, Leila Cardi, I'm doing technical support for today's event. I reside on Nipmuc, Pecumtuck, and Wabanaki Confederacy land in the hills of Western Massachusetts, and we encourage you to look up and see where you are coming from. And if you are interested in sharing that, please feel free to share that in the chat. But those are our introductory pieces of today's event. And so I am now going to hand it over to Dr. Ashley Stewart and Ronnie Hodges to talk about Changing the Conversation, C4 Innovations podcast that is also sometimes co-sponsored by MHTTC.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Lee. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Ronnie and I are very thrilled to be here. As you'll see, my slides do have captioning on them. If you use any assistive technology and or you have captioning enabled on your computer and they contradict each other, please let me know. But let's start with some introductions. Who are we? So my name is Ashley Stewart. I'm the director of the Center on Equity at C4 Innovations. I'm a professor, I'm a mental health provider, and I'm a very privileged and honored often host of the Changing the Conversation podcast. I'm also one of the team members who works very closely on many of the MHTTC collaborations. And so we know that there's some familiar faces in the room. So hello, it's good to see you again. But I also turn it over to Ronnie, who might be a familiar face to many of you as well, to introduce herself.
Hello, thank you. My name is Ronnie Hodges. I go by Ronnie. I am the Senior Project Manager at C4 Innovations and the Senior Manager of Operations and Innovation at Art for Justice, a nonprofit that is sister to C4. I've had the privilege of being a guest on the Changing the Conversation podcast twice with Ashley, and I'm excited to be here with you all today to talk about what we've done and what we've learned in the process.
Would love to hear from folks who are in the room as well. Like, tell us where you're joining from, your organization, what part of the world you're in. I would love to hear from you. You're welcome to put it in the chat or come off of mute, whichever you prefer.
My name is Maya Lee. I'm from Indianapolis, Indiana. I have lived experience with a lot of things. I have the honor to being a great grandmother and a mother to my children. I'm just actually excited to hear what this is about today. I'm really new to doing this, so this is something that I really like doing and enjoying. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mom. Thank you for sharing with us. It's great to see you. Hey, Victor, good to see you. Thank you for putting it in the chat. Good to see you. Other folks, who else do we have in the room? Give folks a moment. I'm sure some folks are typing, and some people might be audio only today, which is okay too. Welcome, Kevin. Welcome, Michelle, Hunter, and Paul. If you're typing, please continue to type. No rush at all. We would love to hear where you're joining us from. Thanks, Kevin. Great to see you. While folks are still typing in the chat, I'm going to go ahead and kind of get us started with what we plan to talk about today. I brought in my prop, one of my mini podcasting microphones that we have. But changing the conversation as Lee mentioned initially, and just recently put the link in the chat. It's the C4 podcast, and we have the amazing opportunity to often partner with organizations, work with our actual partners to bring podcasts in as an innovative way to share information. You know, there's a lot of ways to communicate narratives, to tell stories, to inspire, to provide information, to get to the real deal, to give learning opportunities to the communities, to our community partners, to people with lived experience. Like, there's so many ways that we can communicate it. And oftentimes we'll do that in terms of trainings, we'll host community-based sessions. Sometimes we'll write things and publish things, but there's also the power of podcasting, and that is a great opportunity for people who want to participate, who want to be part of the conversation, who want to listen in, who want to hear from people with lived experience, who want to hear from the innovators or leaders in fields, who want to hear from subject matter experts, what's going on and what people are doing. Podcasts provide a timely and a time efficient and effective way to really communicate some important information. And so our partners have utilized podcasts in a multitude of creative ways to engage their communities, but also to share really important information. So our podcasts and our guests typically focus on critical topics. I'm very proud to say that there aren't topics that we shy away from. If there's an idea or an innovation or a social issue that needs to be described, often we will create a space to have that conversation on the podcast. We typically talk about equity, substance use, mental health, homelessness, trauma, and the MHTTC has sponsored multiple episodes of the podcast, and those topics tend to be directly aligned with initiatives that the MHTTC has, including re-engaging and engaging Native and Indigenous youth, Aboriginal youth, and communities more broadly, the importance of fostering and creating authentic and inclusive environments, as well as topics that honor and bring the light to lived expertise. A lot of times when we talk about expertise, folks are thinking about learned things, right? Like things that people studied. But at C4 and in collaboration with MHTTC, the prioritization is really heavily on creating spaces for lived narratives and people's true stories. And so I thought it would be a great opportunity as one of our hosts to kind of talk about what that experience is like. And Ronnie, who's been part of a few of the MHTTC specific podcasts, specifically one that we did on authenticity in the workplace and belongingness. We're going to talk about that experience a little bit and how we really bring an authentic lens to podcasting. Ronnie, anything on that, on kind of the background of the podcast culture?
I think, now is the time where everybody wants podcasts. So being able to come into this as a relevant space, as a kind of hot spot in communicating and being able to bring relevant information that we work on with our partners, and that can bring a different learning medium for folks to learn about these different topics.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you, Lee. So Lee just put into the chat the episode on belongingness in the workplace. That is Ronnie and I. And then Ronnie and I also, it was such a popular requested topic that we did a part 2 to it that talked about celebrating yourselves and others, which you can see that one on the C4 website as well. So we have just some of the most recent ones that have been posted, some of the recent topics, just to give you an idea of the types of things that we'll talk about. Again, this is a very short list. There's a multitude of things. In fact, there's no there's no limit to what we can cover. But recently, we've talked about centering equity and how do you engage communities dynamically when conducting a regional summit. So let's say an organization is thinking about doing a summit, a statewide funded organization wants to bring in different experts, want to bring in lived expertise, folks want to bring in intra-professional teams together to talk about a central topic. We talked about what were some of the things that you can expect when planning something as large as a regional summit, as well as some things to be considerate of, and what are best practices there. We have some MHTTC specific podcasts that released recently, including culturally responsive care and early psychosis. Is a series, so you can see that the last 3 episodes, all in partnership with MHTTC, have been released recently. We talk a lot about motivational interviewing and different strategies. You can see there's 24 to date episodes on motivational interviewing. So maybe someone who's learning or wanting to implement motivational interviewing could do that there. I know that I've also done an episode around equity and MI. So that's also a topic that's available for folks to listen to. We've done one recently on gender affirming care, celebrating yourselves and others in the workplace. What does it look like to lean in a remote environment or in an office space to encourage other people and to keep team morale up and engaged? So we really took the time to talk about that and to celebrate yourself and others. And another example of a recent podcast is talking about peer support and what intersectionality looks like in peer support, bringing in a guest who really has spent their life's work understanding the dynamics of peer support and what this peer support looks like. How do you align cultural relevance to that? Who has access to knowledge and information about peer support and who doesn't? So that was a really dynamic, also MHTTC partnered podcast that was released recently. So let's talk about like the changing conversation. And I would love to pause here for a moment and kind of gather from the group, what are some of the things you hope to take away from the session? I know you read the topic, you were interested in the webinar series, and we're certainly going to talk about the prioritization of authenticity. We'll talk a little bit about what it takes, things that we learned along the way, things that were surprising to us, how we kind of think through topics and guests and ensure the flow of it is one that's really reflective of the attention that the topics deserve. So those are things that we plan to talk about today. But I also wanted to gauge from the group, what are some of the things that you hope to take away from our time together this week and next? You feel welcome. We're a small group. You could put it in the chat or you can come off of mute and tell us. So again, that's one thing that you're hoping to learn from this webinar. Mhm. Yeah, so some folks put in the chat, and just so you know, if you put something in the chat and you send it to everyone, that's amazing. I'll read your comments. I'm going to read the comments in the chat in case anyone doesn't have access to the chat. And if you want to share something that you don't want me to associate your name with, please feel welcome to share it with me or Ronnie directly, and we'll read the comment, assuming it's for the group without your name. So whichever you're most comfortable with. So Kevin shares being able to have those critical conversations with clients in a comfortable, natural, authentic, genuine manner. Yeah, absolutely. For me, knowing when to say what to say, especially when there's a long period of silence. Oh my goodness, yes. As I'm a professor too, so long periods of silence are something that I had to get really comfortable with and learn to navigate. So I appreciate that, like the common cap. And I suppose just to learn learning potential and positive ways to lean into those conversations that may be tough to have. Good, that's good. Yeah, hoping to learn everything that you can as you're new to the topic. Yeah. So let's lean into that for a moment. What does it mean, or what does it look like to have difficult conversations in an authentic way? What might that look like? How might that feel if you're having a difficult conversation and it feels really authentic? What does that feel like? Uncomfortable. Yeah, feels like vulnerability. I love that. And one thing that I think podcasts really show us is that there's power in the silence. We assume that when we're talking about something, there's a natural desire to talk really fast or to get through content or to say everything perfectly. One of the things that's so powerful about recording a podcast, or something that I've learned in recording a podcast, is it teaches you a very valuable lesson that it's okay to slow down. It's okay to have extra long pauses. It's okay to say something. And most importantly, it's okay to reframe what it is that you said, right? We can start out a conversation one way and then realize that there's a potential to reframe, to revisit, to reevaluate what it is we're saying and how we're saying it. Now, this comes in a lot of different ways, because in podcasts, you can literally edit out the ums and the silence. It's better to have long pauses than to rush through statements for editing purposes. But ultimately, it also gives us some critical insight into the vulnerability of conversations. And when you're talking to someone, a lot of times, many of us need time and space to process. We live in such a dynamic society where you're expected to have your thoughts perfectly formulated in a given moment. But for most of us, that's not how our brains work. There's a necessity to create a space where revisiting is welcome, where we can start to talk about something and then change our minds. And so one of the ways that we prioritize authenticity in our podcast is by making time in the beginning and in the end for people to change their mind about what they said, to recognize that we might be processing in the moment, that we're thinking about things in the moment, that we say and express things in response to a question, but that might not really be our full and complete thought on a particular topic. And in that way, it's okay to pause and to come back to and say, earlier I said this, but what I really meant or what I really think about it is that. That's beautiful vulnerability in critical conversations and absolutely necessary when having conversations that require a level of authenticity. We cannot challenge what we cannot acknowledge. And so we have to be willing to put the topic on the table to even talk about it. I typically would start off sessions with some equity-centered conversational best practices. And, today's conversation is more centered around podcasts, but when we come together next week, I can bring those too, which would really help with what I'm hearing folks say, which is about leaning into difficult conversations, knowing how to engage conversations in vulnerable and authentic ways. And I love what Lizzie you just put in the chat about depending on the situation and person having a discussion. Sometimes it's okay to feel uncomfortable. So what do you do in that discomfort? And how do you kind of change the narrative about it? So we'll incorporate that next week. We really hope that everyone joins us next week so we can kind of talk about that more. But Ronnie, any thoughts on that?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. Yeah. Just being open and knowing that what you hear on a podcast is edited, but there is kind of reflection there and a back and forth to be able to fully get out your thoughts during that process.
Yeah. And how we run our podcasts is actually quite similar to how we would run or, create space for a conversation. We prioritize authenticity. And so in order to do that, we also prioritize bringing in people with lived experience, expertise. There's a lot of folks who have knowledge or maybe even like myself teach on a topic. But teaching and learning about something is very different than living through something. And so a top priority for our work, a top priority for being equity centered, a top priority for being authentic and inclusive is to seek out folks who have a different experience, who have the most paramount experience, and that's to have lived through it. So we intentionally seek out people who we know can bring that subject matter expertise, and appreciate for people for bringing the expertise, recognizing that it is absolutely a gift and that it is the most valuable form of knowledge that we can have in a guest. And so that's a big part of it. And there's a level of honoring that comes with that to ensure that it's not superficial, that it's not exploitive, but instead it's really genuinely lending that mic and giving that space to the person with that lived expertise. And another thing that we do to really help facilitate that is we create themes and we allow natural conversations to occur. We don't script it. We don't even go by question, that sometimes we will send like a list of questions to think about, but the conversation evolves. And so we might say, we're going to do a podcast on being authentic in the workplace. And so Ronnie and I get together, we say, okay, we're going to do a conversation about it. And then we say, okay, what are some of the things that someone who's listening to this podcast might be interested in? And Ronnie and I process through and we say, it's really hard to be authentic in your workspace when there is some critical aspect of your identity that is outside of the norm of what is valued within the workplace. So how do you really show up as your authentic self, understanding that systemic and structural marginalization exists? How do you really show up as yourself? And we go, okay, that's good. We don't dive into it more than we just acknowledge that that's what we're going to talk about. And then we get on the podcast, he puts the go button, and me and Ronnie start having this difficult conversation. It's from a place of being willing to ask each other questions from a mutual base of respect that says, Ronnie and I are both here on this podcast with two maybe completely different ideas about something, but both with the intention of ensuring that people can feel like they belong and that they're welcome in the work environment. So that's the basis for the conversation. That's the mutuality. That's the place where it overlaps. And we go back to that to say, how do we explore this topic from different perspectives and different vantage points that move towards this goal of making sure that people can feel welcome and included, from valuing the reality that when people can be their most authentic self in the workplace, everything improves. People are more bold and creative and innovative if they're able to be their true selves and not depleting so much energy trying to conform to the norms of the organization. So we come to the conversation with that as our platform. And then we give space. There's sometimes Ronnie will put something and I'll say, that's so good. I don't even have a response. And I'll have to sit in for a moment in silence to think about what it is I can say. Or if you listen to the podcast, you hear me go, oh, that's so good, all the time. Because I'm not even sure what amazingness she's getting ready to say. Or sometimes I'll say, you know, that's interesting. I didn't think about it like that. But what I'm thinking, and what I'm thinking. So there doesn't always have to be agreement, but there is that really important mutual base that we're navigating from that's important. To that point, you might see different podcasts where they're intentionally being confrontational or what's the word I'm looking for? Combative. Like the intention is to get really differing opinions and get like an argument going. Well, that some folks choose to have conversations that way. We choose to have the conversation stem from a mutual goal, which in this particular case was to ensure that people can feel like they belong and that people can be their authentic selves. Or, as I mentioned, that there's people who know what gender affirming practices are, that we talk about intersectionality and Black and Indigenous experiences in recovery. We start with that basis. Ronnie, as we have gone through this process together, particularly with this episode, what comes to mind for you?
I really appreciate the authenticity of the engagement that we have on the podcast. Because I think sometimes when you go the question route, like, oh, I'm going to ask you questions 1 through 3, we're going to take a little break, it lends itself to you thinking about the next question that's coming and not being in the moment and really thinking about what it is that's coming up for you at that time. So I really like the kind of organic nature of our conversations during that process because it's not rehearsed. It's not like you got some scholar, fully thought out idea. It really is a conversation that's growing and budding, and it makes for a more engaging podcast for the listener because it doesn't feel so stiff or rehearsed. So I think that's what's really made it relatable for folks when we do these podcasts just across as an organization, for people to be able to really tune in because it's like you're having a conversation with a friend in the process.
Mm-hmm. And on the logistical end of that, we don't say like, well, what Ronnie said, we're not talking to anyone, we're talking to each other. So anyone who's listening jumps in on the conversation. I love what you just said, Ronnie, or what you made me think of. And it's a conversation between the two of us, or however many people on the podcast, but that also gives us the experience for people who are tuning in that they're part of the conversation too, as opposed to I'm talking to this ambiguous audience without consideration that the audience has a meaningful investment in the conversation that's happening too. Any thoughts or questions before we jump into this next slide? Let's give a moment for folks to process. So some of the things that we do to facilitate that process is we start by checking in on expectations, right? There's things that we want to do that are logistical. You want to make sure you're in a clear space, that that we might pick a topic We might pick a topic that is really timely and relevant to something, and then something happens in society. And are we willing to take a step back and say, you know what, and this is the perfect time to have this conversation or not to have this conversation? In some of my other work, I do a lot of work around gun violence, trauma-informed practices. And sometimes the timing of it is really important to be trauma-informed as we engage in conversations, whether you're talking to clients or whether you're talking to someone else on a podcast. You want to be able to really honor the time that was happening. Now, it's really unique with the podcast because the time that it's recorded might not be the time that it's listened to. But that's really becomes irrelevant when the goal and the purpose of it is to honor what's on the table. So if we're talking about an incident, something that just happened, something that's contemporary in society, creating that space to honor that in that moment is so important. So even if I'm watching it 2 or 10 years down the road, the authenticity of that can be felt because we're engaged, because we're present, because we're being really trauma informed in that exact moment. Whether it's in a conversation or preparing for the podcast, letting people know there's no expectation that any of us are perfect in this process. People get really anxious when they get ready to get on a podcast. They're like, I'm going to say so many ums, or I'm going to say the wrong thing, or I don't have my thoughts fully together. And when do we ever really? If we navigated life with perfectly scripted responses all the time, would it be authentic? It's the highs and the lows, it's the emotion that comes out that makes it a conversation as opposed to something different. And so I think about when I'm facilitating conversations more broadly, it's about letting people know that their voices matter and that their perspectives matter, that we can always come back to things as people continue to process it more, that we lead with a lens of inquisition, wanting to learn more, wanting to hear more, that we respect the dignity and worth of the other people who we're engaged with. And so it's no different in the podcast than it is in those conversations. And so when we come together next time and we go through that list of different things to check in about, to ensure our best practices before engaging in difficult conversations, we'll begin to see that setting that stage is so important. Thinking about the rules for the road of any conversation, especially when we're getting into difficult or challenging conversations, plays a huge role in the success of the conversation. We're listening to respond often in our lives. Someone says something, we're thinking about what it is we want to say back, as opposed to listening to understand or to honor or appreciate. So we want to make sure that we are clear on those things. As I mentioned, you want to create support for processing during the conversation. I want to think about that a little bit more deeply and giving the space for people to do that. If you are interested or planning to record a podcast or participate in a podcast, that's an important thing to ask. If I'm processing something live in the recording, is it a possibility that if I have a moment to think about it and it's not framed the way that I hoped, is there an opportunity to come back to it later in the podcast, or request that it be included or not? We mentioned that we use a very conversational tone, talking to host to guest and host to host, or whatever the structure of it looks like. And then one of our best practices, a little secret that we do, is that we start the recording well before and well after. Because yes, when you know that the light is on and people are recording you, you start to get into a nature of like the feeling, the desire to perform. And then once the conversation kicks in, people tend to really feel like it is an interpersonal conversation, which it is. But naturally, there's some things that people say in their true and authentic tone right before and right after that really is the most profound part of it. Because when we can have authentic conversation, that's really when things begin to shift and change. And then also posing questions that bring out the natural thoughts in the guest. So we could have our planned questions or scripted questions. But when you start to say something that brings up a thought, as the facilitator or the host of this process, digging in and bringing out those thoughts is important. So someone mentioned earlier in the chat about critical conversation with clients. I think is really relatable in that way. If you're working with a client, you're working with a participant or someone who you're serving through your work, when you ask them a question, you ask that question with a really intentional why. The reason you're asking the question is ideally with the hope of getting more information that helps to support the work that you all are doing. And so with the podcast, it's the same thing. Why am I asking this question? This question is going to inspire what thought? Create a space for what thought? You know, what are we not talking about? How can I frame this in a way that's going to evoke the opportunity, the safety, and the culture that says it's okay to talk about this topic in this space? Any other thoughts around preparing for the process, things that stand up to you, Ronnie, or touching on these points? Anything I missed?
I think that's a good coverage of it and how we kind of go through the process.
Awesome. So the next thing we wanted to talk about were the emotions. And a reason why we don't often do or like vulnerable conversations is because, well, they can bring up emotion. And I think when we have critical conversations in life, sometimes we can be avoidant or people can be avoidant of it because we're unsure. Maybe we haven't had time to process it before. And we're very well aware that the conversation could evoke more things for us than we were prepared to talk about. And so we stay on the safer side of conversation. So something that's really important to talk about here in terms of changing the conversation is how do you create a playful space with emotion? Being willing to go off script. There's a natural joyfulness to many of the conversations where we laugh, where we behave silly, where we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and say, I really like what you said, and I had never thought about that, right? There's also been podcasts where someone has said something and it hit me deeply. I remember I did a podcast with one individual who talked about people who were chronically undertouched and the trauma, and specifically how that related to Black male identity. And I got emotional. Right? And so one could say, I could have been like, cut the conversation. I need to process this more. But I also recognized that there was so much beauty in what was being shared, evoking emotions from me. And so the willingness to say, I'm actually feeling so much emotion based on what you just said, it makes me emotional to think about because, you know, what's that experience been like for you? Creating that opportunity for the conversation to deepen, for that emotion to fuel a more powerful conversation, as opposed to zipping it up, which is what we tend to do. We zip up our feelings, we zip up our emotions. We don't want to be too joyful, too laughing, too silly in these spaces. We don't want to be too emotional in these spaces. So we zip it up. But the reality of it is that showing that vulnerability can deepen a conversation in ways that years and years and years might not be able to. And so rolling with that is so important and has been easily one of the most powerful tools that we've had to have really profound conversations. The topics that come up after a really good laugh, or the question that comes out of a tearful moment of realization. Thoughts from anyone? Questions, comments? Something powerful in the dynamic between the two individuals who are having the conversation and the relationship that they have. You know, I think one of the reasons why Ronnie and my podcast does so well is because of our relationship. And I'm hoping that we can spend a little time talking about how, when in doing a podcast on supporting yourself and other people in the workplace, how our own examples, but also our dynamic between she and I really was captured in that podcast. Ronnie, we had a really good time. What were some of the things that kind of stood out to you about recording those 2 episodes?
I mean, I think that that piece about jumping into the conversation before the recording starts, it was just a level of comfort there. We work really well together, but and we have conversations offline, like without microphones. But being able to have those conversations on air, and it still feel really natural and organic. And I think that our working relationship really spoke through. And I think just the laugh, like even when we did the second episode and we started talking about some of the things that were kind of trending in social media and how that was relatable to what we were doing, we came up with yes math, the hashtag yes math. I don't know if you all are familiar with the trend that was going around, like girl math or boy math or different kind of math that were going on, when we thought about how to, give yourself props or celebrate yourself. And we came up with yes math, and just the conversation that grew out of that, thinking about what we're going to talk about on the episode. And like that'll be really relevant and funny and fun, but still lends itself to the message about celebrating yourself. So I think that relationship really helped produce something that was really fun and relatable, but still helped to convey a message that people could relate to. But I think even without that, I think that without a relationship, I think the way that you engage folks on the front end really helps move things along on the back end. So I really appreciate that about the podcast in general.
Just looking through to see if anyone's unmuting, just to see if you have any questions or thoughts. So this part is a little interactive, and if you're not able to interact, just let us know in the chat. But we're not going to do breakout rooms or anything like that because we're a small enough group. But the next couple parts are helping us really think through the intentionality that goes behind a conversation. And I just remind us now, we have about 15 minutes left in this webinar series today. Our content that we'll cover next week will focus on strategies for engaging difficult conversations. We heard that very clearly that folks are interested in that. So we will cover that. In this moment, I want you to imagine that you are getting ready to start your own podcast, or maybe you have a podcast and you're going to host an episode, or you're going to propose an episode. What is a topic that you'd be interested in? And I mean, you personally, what is a topic that you'd be interested in either talking about or hearing about? So let me lean in here and ask this question, because I think it's a fairly easily reflective question, but I also, being a trauma-informed educator, I'd never just call on people. I know that that's a strategy that some folks do when there's a lot of silence in the room. But I also recognize that we're all processing information differently. So I want to name that and create space for that. I'm wondering if some folks, if you don't know a topic you'd be interested in, maybe could help us be present in, what are you processing? Is it that you're not sure what topics you would be interested in? Is it that you don't really see yourself as potentially participating in podcasts? Or maybe you're like me, you like to participate in podcasts, but you're not really a listener of podcasts. What is the silence that you're experiencing about? You don't know what to say. Let us know. What is the silence you're experiencing? Maybe away from a device where you can actually type in. You're hoping that other people will contribute first to give you an idea. Okay. I see someone says directly, they're still thinking. They're not sure what podcast idea they'd be interested in. That's fair. We have some to suggest. Thank you for sharing that. Other folks. You don't have a lot of experience in it, but want to. I can appreciate that. We can help with that. Well, let's just say that folks are interested in, thank you for folks who sent messages directly. Let's say that people are interested in a topic. Let's see, Ronnie, what's a good topic we could use as an example?
Engaging people with lived experience.
That's a good one. That's a good one. So how many of you engage with people with lived experience in your day-to-day work? Okay. I see. Saw Catherine's hand. I saw Maya sit up. Anyone else work with people with lived experience in your work? Okay, couple folks. So if we're trying to engage someone with lived experience, what are some of the things that we would want to take into consideration? What are the intersectionalities of people's lived experience? Is it that they've experienced something once? Is it that someone has a unique perspective of how they're navigating systems? So when we're thinking about who we want to engage, we're putting a level of intentionality into that too. Think about who and what and why. So we just did a series of conversations about people who had lived experience with justice system involvement and mental health diagnoses. And so there was a very unique intersection of folks' experiences, but they were all very different. There were so many things that were similar, but the recommendations that they made to policymakers were so robust and creative based on the intricacies of their experiences. So you might want to ask people more about, what was that experience like for you? So you could begin to even uncover what topics would be the best fit for this guest, because you want to ask questions that are going to empower them to tell their story, to tell their narrative, and that will demonstrate the level of respect. Then you might want to go about it by proposing different topics. What does it look like to ask somebody, I would like to have this conversation with you, but I would love to know what you think is being under discussed as it relates to your experience. Starting there saying, what is it that you are experiencing that you feel like people aren't paying attention to? Now you've leaned into the most difficult part of that conversation, the most ignored part of that conversation, to lead with something really profound and dynamic. And then you lean into those. You create a space for those. You honor those things and build questions upon it. I know that when you and I spoke initially, you shared a bit about your experience, and I thought it was really important. Would you mind sharing that experience here with us today? And that person tells a story. You know, a lot of people underappreciate the nuance of what you just shared. What do you think people are missing about the topic? So you start to form your questions that get deeper into the conversation. It's more than just asking, what do they call those questions? It's more than just not asking close-ended questions, right? That's way down the list. Well above us, being above and beyond not asking closing questions, you're asking questions that are opening up a more vulnerable space, a more honest space, a more authentic space. Many of us who have suppressed identities or areas of our identities that are systemically and structurally marginalized don't often bring it up in spaces because why? We're ostracized or marginalized, or people don't care, or we've had negative experiences with doing so. So if you're facilitating a conversation, it is the responsibility to create the space for it to be safe enough for people to share. And so that's a place that you'll want to lean into. And then you'll want to ensure that there is something really important that folks like to not talk about is, are you able to compensate people, particularly with the topic that Ronnie picked is so perfect, folks with lived expertise. A lot of times we expect people with lived experience to come and tell us their stories for free. It's an honor to tell the stories. No, we have to understand the meritoriousness of lived expertise is something that's valuable. It brings something into the conversation that no one else can bring. And so therefore it must be honored in that same way. It is just the way that you would provide compensation for a scientist or a subject matter expert in something is the same way we should compensate and acknowledge people with lived expertise. It is a form of expertise. And in fact, it's so unique that it requires a special level of attentiveness to it. It's people's emotional labor as well as their learned labor. And so you want to ensure that you're compensating people very thoroughly. You also want to make sure that there's mutual promotion. So maybe this person has an initiative or they're doing something that they're really excited about. Well, creating that space and that platform to provide them a place in your show notes, if you will, to uplift and empower what they're working on. Okay. So we're going to stop there for now so that we can spend some time next time talking about engaging or having difficult conversations. And I know Lee has some closing slides for us, but we're really grateful for your time today, and we hope to see you back next week. Ronnie, was there anything you wanted to add?
No, thank you all for joining us today. Even if you couldn't participate,
Yeah.
and share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you next time. Hopefully you'll be able to engage with us a little more.
Lee, we'll turn it back to you to close us out.
Thank you. All right, folks, I'm going to bring up our last few slides. Oh, that is not the slides. Sorry. Apologies. Even tech support sometimes runs into challenges. All right. So as shared, today's webinar was presented in partnership with New England MHTTC. As a SAMHSA funded organization, we are pleased to have the opportunity to evaluate our services. We're going to be sending out a link to our evaluation survey in email in follow-up to this event. We appreciate your honest, anonymous feedback, which will also provide information to SAMHSA and assist us in planning future meetings and programs. Your feedback counts. Attendees providing their email address will also receive this survey after the close of today's event, along with a link to a video archive and a slide presentation. So thank you again so much for attending. We hope to see you next week for our second in this series,